Sometimes a new love holds the promise of a fulfilling future.
When you are being isolated, it's easy to receive the attention and possibly fall in love.
She found a comfort in him that she hadn't experienced in a long time.
But fresh starts often come with fresh problems.
She knew that her money was running out.
Her ex-husband was one of Memphis's most favorite sons, and everybody there loved him.
When you're backed up against the wall, how far would you go for a second chance at love?
I couldn't believe it. I broke down in tears.
Hello?
It just almost sounded like you were in a movie, but it was real.
I had never seen anything like it.
Love can cause you to take drastic measures.
Hello?
Thursday, July 22nd, 2010, Memphis, Tennessee. It's a hot summer day in one of the largest and most populous cities along the Mississippi.
Memphis is unrivaled when it comes to incredible music, delicious barbecue, and the most soulful people you'll ever meet.
The city is also home to a major professional sports team, the NBA's Grizzlies.
Memphis is a great city. I love it. People are very into their sports, very into the basketball.
As residents gear up for the Grizzlies' next season, the Collierville Police Department, just outside of Memphis, receives an alarming call.
A woman named Deborah Marion called to report her son, 34-year-old former NBA star Lorenzen Wright, missing.
Deborah tells the 911 operator that none of his family or friends have seen or spoken to him in 4 days, and no one can get a hold of him.
She says this isn't like him to not be in touch with anyone and that she's worried about her son.
Lorenzen Wright was born in Oxford, Mississippi on November 4th, 1975, to Deborah Marion and Herb Wright.
Herb had a major influence in his basketball career. Getting prepared and getting him involved was the key.
By the time he reached high school, Lorenzen was a talented basketball player who towered over others with his 6'11" stature.
It was clear that Lorenzen had basketball in his DNA, but also he was a person who cared about people.
He was just so charming, just so respectful for everyone. Never thought he was bigger than anyone.
To help him have more opportunities during his sophomore year of high school, Lorenzen's parents moved him to Memphis.
Herb started seeing Lorenzen get recognition playing in high school in Oxford, Mississippi. That's when Herb decided to bring Lorenzen up to Memphis, Tennessee and work on his game.
His success landed him multiple college scholarships, but he chose the University of Memphis, and the city loved him for it.
It was kind of a pretty big deal. He was one of Memphis's most favorite sons. Everybody there loved him.
Then, during his junior year, Lorenzen's gaze shifted slightly to the coach's beautiful daughter, Shara Robinson. Memphis native Shara Robinson experienced a great loss at an early age.
Her mom died at an early age, so her dad raised her. When a child, specifically a daughter, loses their mother at a young age and there is no motherly role in their life, it could have been difficult for her to navigate in the world.
Shara depended heavily on her father for support.
That, in fact, is how she ended up meeting Lorenzen. because he was one of the coach's star athletes.
The two had an immediate attraction to each other.
Cheryl was the most loving person, and I thought that they were a good fit.
Shara was absolutely gorgeous. 5'10", just this golden brown skin, a beautiful smile. So it was not a surprise that Lorenzen noticed her and was interested in her.
And Shara felt the same about Lorenzen.
I think any female in her right mind at that time would have seen that smile that just lit up his face. He's 6'11", she's 5'10". They just kind of fit.
The new lovers talked often about sharing their life together.
They both wanted a big family. So Sarah immediately got pregnant, and they started their family.
Then, in 1996, before he graduated college, Lorenzen's dreams of going pro became a reality.
He was a top 10 draft pick. He was drafted by the Los Angeles Clippers.
The couple immediately packed their bags and moved to LA, where their lives changed overnight.
They lived a life of opulence. Their kids went to the best schools, and they traveled around the world on vacation.
Then, in 1998, after having 2 children together, Lorenzen and Shara officially tied the knot.
The way the setup was, it was just absolutely beautiful. It was like a TV-style wedding.
Following 3 years with the Clippers, Lorenzen played briefly for the Atlanta Hawks before being traded to the Memphis Grizzlies.
They were able to go back home to Memphis and were thrilled. Bought a large house right outside of Memphis in Collierville and settled in to raise their family.
Lorenzen playing for the Memphis Grizzlies was a big deal. They embraced him with everything, with open arms. They loved him.
But the celebration is short-lived. In March of 2003, after having 5 children together, the couple endured a horrific tragedy.
Their youngest child passed away very unexpectedly, and that was a big stressor on the relationship.
You can just imagine the pain and suffering that was happening at that time. The marriage started unraveling.
3 years later, Lorenzen was traded back to the Atlanta Hawks, and he and Shara separated.
Shara remains in their suburban home with the children, and he comes back and forth for family events all the time and to see his children.
By February 2010, the marriage was officially over. That same year, he retired from the NBA after a bad thumb injury. But he'd had an amazing career.
He has this legacy of being in the NBA for more than a decade, but something is missing.
He decided he wanted to rekindle his marriage with Shara and bring his family back together.
But now, 5 months after his divorce and retirement, Lorenzen is missing.
Lorenzen's family tells the police that he came into town 4 days earlier on the 18th and ran some errands before he was dropped off at his ex-wife Shara's house. The next day, his family said that he missed one of his sister's baby showers and no one could reach him.
He was not seen as somebody who would miss really critical family events. So that had to raise red flags.
When we asked Cheryl, has she seen Lorenzen, only thing she said was, yeah, they spent a night together. She said that he left with somebody in a Chrysler 300.
But she tells Lorenzen's friends and family not to worry.
In the back of my mind, I'm like, that doesn't sound like the Lorenzen I know. But we had no choice but to go with it.
His family says as the days continued, Lorenzen remained absent for multiple other family gatherings. That's when his mother called police.
Lorenzen's mother insisted on filing a police report because this was just unusual for him and she was feeling that something was wrong.
As the entire city looks for Lorenzen, investigators make an alarming discovery.
Hello? Hello? I don't have nothing but gunshots.
On July 22, 2010, Deborah Marion called the Collierville, Tennessee police to report her son, former NBA star Lorenzen Wright, missing.
Lorenzen hadn't been seen in 4 days after his best friend dropped him off at his ex-wife Sarah's house.
Since Shara's home is his last known whereabouts, investigators start there.
Shara did confirm what the family said, and that the last time she had seen him was at her house on the 18th.
But instead of acting unconcerned, like she allegedly was with his family, she tells detectives that Lorenzen left under very suspicious circumstances.
She said he had gone into the attic and gotten a box of some kind and told her that he was going to meet some people and that was the last time she had seen him. Shara speculated that the box contained either money or drugs, but she said she didn't know for sure.
When investigators asked Shara why she didn't say anything about that, she explained that it was common for Lorenzen to associate with dangerous people and engage in illegal activities and drugs for money.
But something doesn't sit right with detectives.
If that had really happened, then why wasn't Shara immediately concerned when he went missing? And why did she tell his family him being missing wasn't unusual?
To get to the bottom of this, investigators request Lorenzen's cell phone records.
They start gathering clues. They start talking to tons and tons of witnesses. Obviously, very, very high profile. Everybody wants this thing solved, and they want it solved quickly.
As law enforcement and Lorenzen's inner circle frantically look for him, news of his disappearance spreads like wildfire.
This made national news. This was on ESPN. It was on CBS News. Good Morning America. It hit all of the syndicated news stations.
The whole nation clings to the hope that the NBA star will be found, safe and soon. Then, 5 days later, on the 27th of July, investigators finally get the break they need when his phone records come in.
They looked at his phone call history and saw that there's a 911 call by him that goes to the Germantown police.
The call was made on July 19th at 12:05 a.m. Detectives reach out to the Germantown Police Department to get a copy of the 911 call. And what they hear is shocking.
Germantown 911, where's your emergency? Hello? 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 I have nothing but gunshots.
Unfortunately, the operator didn't follow up with the phone call.
The protocol would be that you call back immediately, but that did not happen. And so it fell into a deep crack.
It's obvious that foul play is involved, and detectives fear they might be looking for a body. They immediately check the cell towers.
They were able to triangulate an area where he was based on the cell towers that call routed through. And it's this area called Callus Cutoff, which is it's literally a road kind of cutting through a woodsy area not too far from the interstate.
The area sits in the center of 3 jurisdictions.
Collierville police join forces with the Memphis Police Department and the Shelby County Sheriff's Department to search the area for Lorenzen.
So when they get there on the road and they're finding shell casings, they're probably thinking, okay, it's got to be here somewhere.
What they find is deeply disturbing.
Couldn't believe it. I broke down in tears. It was like the worst pain I've ever had in my life.
In the summer of 2010, authorities are searching a field near Memphis, Tennessee, in an area called Callus Cutoff.
They're looking for any sign of Lorenzen Wright, and they know his 911 call came from that area.
It doesn't take long for them to find what they're looking for.
They finally came across a deceased body. At the time, you can imagine being out in the heat in Memphis, which is very hot and very humid. The body was really, really badly decomposed.
Between the shoes, clothes, and remnants of his tattoos, investigators are all but certain that this is Lorenzen Wright.
He still had diamond earrings in his ears. He had a very, very expensive watch. So they kind of could immediately rule out, okay, this wasn't a robbery.
As the body is moved for autopsy, investigators search the area for evidence.
Memphis Police Department found 25 caliber shell casings, and 9mm shell casings are found around the body and up on the road.
This suggests there may have been 2 shooters. However, despite a thorough search, they are unable to locate any weapons or Lorenzen's cell phone.
Never got the phone. We would have really, really liked to have found that, but that's something that was never recovered.
What was Lorenzen doing there? The next day, on July 29th, medical examiners confirm through dental records the remains are in fact Lorenzen Wright.
They found 1 or 2 bullets in the body, but because the body was so decomposed, they couldn't tell exactly what damage was done where or even how many bullets hit him.
Officially a homicide investigation, detectives visit Lorenzen's ex-wife, Shara. She seems heartbroken by the news, but sheds some light on the location where his body was found.
Callus Cutoff Road was actually a shortcut from Shara's house to Lorenzen's mother's house that he would take all the time. And it was also a sort of lover's lane for them when they wanted to talk or get away from the kids.
Yet, when asked again about the last night he was there, her story changes.
She told some stories like, some Hispanic people came by the house and threatened them.
Shara said some other things that had happened. Her son being approached in the parking lot of his high school. All of these things in conjunction with the story about Lorenzen retrieving this box from the attic.
To investigators, it doesn't look like a drug deal gone wrong.
These guys are killing him because of money. They aren't going to leave a really, really expensive watch and his money and his earrings. I would find that very hard to believe that he went off on a drug deal in the middle of the night.
Before they can question her further, Shara hires a lawyer.
They talk to a lot of people, and they hit a wall and can't really get anywhere else.
So investigators turn to her neighbors to see if they heard or saw anything. And what they learn deepens their suspicions of Shara.
It showed she was trying to hide something.
That's what raised so many red flags for the community at large.
July 10th, Memphis, Tennessee. Police have found the remains of missing former NBA star Lorenzen Wright after he was shot to death multiple times in a field 10 days earlier.
Police have gotten bizarre stories of drugs and strangers from Shara, who was the last person to see him alive.
I think the fact that she couldn't tell a consistent story certainly stood out to police.
They look closer into the couple's marriage, and what they find is jaw-dropping.
There was a lot of volatility in their relationship. There were multiple affairs. I think that Shara was alone with the children for long periods of time. Shara was a pretty dependent person. She really did not like to be alone. So there were periods of estrangement between she and Lorenzen. And I think Shara was lonely.
Shara and Lorenzen were having major financial problems. There had been a home that was foreclosed on, so the money was dwindling.
When their daughter died, the already troubled marriage couldn't withstand the grief. Detectives learned the couple's divorce was finalized just 5 months before.
One of the prerequisites of that divorce was that Shara wanted him to sign a $1 million life insurance policy. And though the money was to go to her children, she was the direct receiver of those funds, as well as his retirement funds, nearly $200,000.
While common for large families to hold such policies, detectives know money can be a strong motive.
Detectives talk to more people and dig some more, but they keep running into dead end after dead end, and the case slowly goes cold.
Then, in May 2012, nearly 2 years after the murder of Lorenzen Wright, investigators receive a shocking tip that breathes new life into the investigation.
A convicted felon named Jimmy Martin says that he knows who killed Lorenzen Wright.
He got convicted of second-degree murder. I'm not sure if he thought, well, maybe if I tell them something, they can somehow do something with my conviction, even though they can't. 2 detectives interviewed him, and they got a story.
Jimmy says the mastermind behind the murder plot was none other than Shara Wright.
Jimmy Martin was Shara's cousin. I think that Jimmy and Shara had a fairly close relationship.
Shara reached out to him, asked for his help, and they had a brainstorming session. The goal was to locate and murder Lorenzen Wright.
But Jimmy says Shara wasn't the only person involved.
He says 2 years earlier, in 2010, he met with Shara and a man named Billy Ray Turner.
Turns out, 41-year-old Billy Ray Turner was no stranger to crime.
If you go back to when he was a young man, he had a few felony convictions, but then seemed to have turned himself around.
Billy ended up owning his own landscaping company and attended church regularly.
Billy was a member of the church that Shara attended, where he also became a deacon.
Quiet guy, religious, like sincere religious belief. Spent a lot of time at church. Also liked the ladies, from what I understand.
Shara and Billy spent a lot of time together at church. And then she hired him to take care of her lawn.
Because that was his legitimate business. Billy Turner would be over there all the time.
It wasn't long before Billy filled the emptiness that Shara was feeling.
When you are being isolated, you're finding comfort in somebody who is consistently there for you in your life. It's not surprising that Shara fell in love with Billy.
He gave her the love and attention that she was really missing in her marriage.
And Billy was no match for Shara's charm.
Shara seemed to have quite a allure to lots of men. He was infatuated with Shara to some degree.
But how did this budding romance lead to murder? Jimmy Martin tells detectives that it was Shara and Billy who killed Lorenzen. He ended up not helping.
Jimmy claimed to have had some issue at his home in Mississippi, and that is why he did not come to Shelby County when this murder was committed.
But he knows how it went down.
Jimmy Martin said that Shara and Billy had told him what happened.
And that description is just so jarring.
May 2012, Memphis, Tennessee. Shara Wright's cousin, Jimmy Martin, has just told police that Shara and her lover, Billy Ray Turner, are the ones who murdered her ex-husband, Lorenzen Wright, 2 years earlier.
There was always suspicion on Shara because she benefited greatly from a life insurance policy. But so far, they haven't been able to find any evidence to prove it.
Jimmy tells detectives that the day after the murder, Shara contacted him and said she needed his metal detector to help her and Billy find the gun she dropped.
He says they came down to my mom's house, got this metal detector, and we had to go back out there to try and find this gun, which they did. They would have had to explain what they were doing out there. And Jimmy knew that it was supposed to happen.
That's when he says they confessed to him what they'd done. Jimmy says Shara had invited Lorenzen to visit.
She might have promised him relations, also an opportunity to see his children.
At some point after going to Shara's home, she and Lorenzen left and then ended up at Cow's Cutoff. She and Lorenzen exited the vehicle that they were in. Billy Turner was probably already there waiting.
Jimmy says that's when Shara and her new boyfriend ambushed Lorenzen.
Jimmy described Billy Turner using a 9mm. He says Billy told him he started shooting at him on the road and he ran into the woods. Shara was shooting a gold .25 caliber pistol, and she shot and then ran off and threw the gun.
But apparently, Lorenzen stopped to call the police at some point and was hiding. Billy saw the light on the phone, then killed him right there.
Jimmy says they found Shara's gun at the crime scene, which she got rid of along with Lorenzen's cell phone. Then he and Billy discarded the 9mm.
He knew that the murder weapon was dumped in a lake in Walnut, Mississippi, this remote area about 45 miles outside of Memphis.
A shocking confession, but investigators aren't totally convinced it's true.
Police probably had some concerns about Jimmy Martin's credibility, understandably.
He's a convicted murderer. That's not an ideal situation. And certainly what he's telling you is that he was also involved, but we have to confirm all these things he's saying.
When asked if anyone else can corroborate his story, Jimmy says there was another witness.
Jimmy said that there was a pregnant female there at these meetings, but had no idea who she was.
Investigators are unable to identify the female, so they focus on finding the gun.
They go out and get the local rescue department in Walnut, Mississippi to dive in the lake.
Police had searched the lake in Mississippi unsuccessfully. They had not found anything at that point.
They don't have any other leads, and that was kind of the end of it.
We thought it was a case that never would be solved.
Four grueling years later, in 2016, the case finally comes back into the spotlight. Memphis police get a new multi-agency gang unit that includes Memphis police officers, Shelby County Sheriff deputies, and ATF agents.
They met and decided that they wanted to bring the Lorenzen Wright case back into their roster.
They are determined to find out who killed the young basketball star.
They see that during the initial search at the lake, the weather was bad, it was raining, and there was just a small group of volunteers.
And so this special unit decided that they were going to seek resources from the FBI to do another search of this lake years later.
Although it's a long shot, they searched the lake and hit the jackpot.
Within 5 minutes, they find a pistol. The 9mm shell casings from the murder scene match the gun. And so then now we're in business. This is like, okay, maybe Jimmy Martin wasn't lying. Let's start working back through everything else. We're putting together a plan that was really, really, really important to confirm every detail we could.
After speaking with Jimmy again, police check in on Shara Wright and Billy Ray Turner to see where they are now.
Billy was still in Collierville, and according to phone records, Shara and Billy hadn't communicated in years.
Shara, she ended up moving to California and just kind of living her life and doing her thing.
She had gone through all but $30,000 of a $1 million life insurance policy, and the money was spent on luxury cars, properties, and other very high-end items.
Detectives have a suspicion that once it comes out that the murder weapon was found, Shara and Billy may communicate again.
So they tapped Billy and Shara's phones, hoping they'd give something away.
And then they waited to see what the two would do.
– 2016, Memphis, Tennessee. After a special unit in the Memphis Police Department reopened the cold-blooded murder case of retired NBA star Lorenzen Wright, they find the murder weapon.
Now they believe Jimmy Martin's story, that Shara Wright and her boyfriend, Billy Ray Turner, were the ones who killed her ex-husband.
They had enough evidence to surveil Shara and Billy Ray. And what they did was put it out into the public that the gun was found, and then they waited to see what the two would do because they assumed that they were going to have to talk.
The plan works.
There were many telephone calls between Shara and Billy Turner.
The police are listening in to see if they were saying anything, and then lo and behold, she all of a sudden makes a trip from California to Memphis, which is very unusual. She sets up a secret meeting with Billy where they're walking up and down the street together, talking. Very, very suspicious.
The unit also devotes a lot of time to finding this mysterious pregnant female who witnessed the meetings between Shara, Jimmy, and Billy.
They were able to talk to family members to see who may have been at Shara's house in 2010 that could have been pregnant and would have been trusted.
That's when police learn that Shara has a cousin named Michelle Johnson who was pregnant at the time.
She and Shara were pretty close, and I believe she helped babysit Shara's children at times.
Detectives bring Michelle in, and she backs up what Jimmy said.
She claimed to have overheard Shara, Billy, and Jimmy plotting to kill Lorenzen.
That was new information that was super important. And I think that probably took her a while because she was scared for her own safety. Then once we got all that, we felt comfortable with charging them.
On December 4th of 2017, investigators descended upon Billy Ray Turner inside of a convenience store.
A week later, Shara Wright is arrested in California and extradited back to Memphis. They both refuse to speak with investigators.
It was very shocking to me that Cheryl did it. The Cheryl that I knew. I didn't think that she wanted to see him harmed in that type of way. It was still just a disbelief to me until I saw the reality.
In July 2019, the community is hit by a shocking curveball.
We're awaiting a trial date for Shara Wright, and huge twist of events. All of a sudden, we find out that there is a plea deal.
She realized that the jury would convict her in all likelihood of first-degree murder because there were many layers of premeditation.
Shara pleads guilty to facilitation of murder and receives 30 years in prison.
She admitted that she was the mastermind in the murder of her ex-husband and the father of her children.
However, she could be released as early as 2027.
The way I look at it, she took a life from him. So she should have got the same sentence. I think that's only fair.
In March 2022, almost 12 years after the murder of Lorenzen Wright, 51-year-old Billy Ray Turner goes to trial. Prosecutors claim that the entire murder plot stemmed from Lorenzen's life insurance policy after he and Shara divorced.
It's $1 million life insurance policy, and that is part of the reason why prosecutors believed that there was motive in this case.
Shara fell in love with Billy Ray Turner, but she also knew that her money was running out.
It's possible that he and Shara would start a life together with this $1 million life insurance policy. And I believe that Shara felt that the only way that Lorenzen could truly be out of her life is if he were dead.
To have the chance of a future with Billy, Shara asks him to help her commit murder.
She had a way of getting things she wanted.
Billy probably liked the idea of having this kind of money, but he wanted a life with Shara too.
So the two of them began planning to kill her ex-husband with her cousin's help.
Her cousin Jimmy wasn't available, so she and Billy decided to pull the murder off themselves.
Afterward, they got rid of evidence, and Shara tried to protect them both by pointing police in the direction of imaginary drug dealers.
Billy's defense team is saying that Jimmy is lying and that he's actually the murderer of Lorenzen Wright.
Jimmy had kind of an airtight alibi that kind of hurt the defense theory that it was Jimmy who was the actual killer. So I think putting all those pieces together, the jury understood what happened and did the right thing.
On October 5th, 2023, Billy Ray Turner is convicted of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy in the death of Lorenzen Wright. He's sentenced to life in prison and 25 years, plus a 16-year sentence for possessing guns as a convicted felon.
Deborah Marion was very, very happy. The whole family was very happy and very pleased.
Jimmy Martin remains in jail on his unrelated murder case. Although justice has finally been served, Lorenzen's family continues to feel his loss every day.
He would have been a wonderful father to see his kids grow up to the kids they are now. It breaks my heart. Nothing's gonna bring him back regardless. But we got the answers that we wanted. We got some type of closure.
At the end of the day, what Shara lost was way more than what she gained. She was so blinded by what she could have had with Billy that
the final tick of an old clock does not signify the end of time, but the sudden, terrifying arrival of a reckoning. For 27 years, the industrial town of Iron Ridge lived in a state of suspended, freezing terror, anchored by the notorious 1999 cold case that shattered the community's collective spine. It was a freezing December night when the flashing lights of a lone patrol car illuminated a scene that would haunt the memory of the region for nearly 3 decades. A vehicle abandoned beneath the rusted grid of the old railway overpass, its engines still humming, the driver's side door flung wide open to the biting winter wind. Inside, a purse left untouched on the passenger seat, a key set dangling from the ignition like a steel pendulum, and a half-written letter melting under the cabin light. But the driver, a 24-year-old bank clerk named Clara Vance, was gone. She had simply vaporized into the midnight fog, leaving behind a sterile vacuum of clues and a town that would never sleep soundly again. The initial response was a chaotic masterclass in panic and confusion, as search teams with bloodhounds and heavy flashlights descended upon the desolate perimeter of the overpass, their boots crunching over ice and discarded gravel. The dogs tracked a faint scent for less than 20 yards before losing it entirely on the asphalt of Route 9, suggesting a sudden, violent interception, a forced entry into another vehicle that left no skid marks, no broken glass, and no signs of a struggle. Investigators picked through the surrounding frozen mud with the raw desperation of men who knew the clock was ticking, but the landscape offered nothing but the mocking groan of the iron overpass above. There was no blood, no struggle markers, no dropped personal items, just a clean, clinical abduction that seemed to defy the sloppy nature of street crime, sparking immediate rumors of a calculated, predatory force operating within the shadows of the county. Within 48 hours, the local news headlines exploded into a frenzy of sensationalism, flashing words like abduction, vanishing, and prime suspect across every television screen in the tri-state area. The shockwaves paralyzed the industrial heartbeat of Iron Ridge. Parents locked their doors before dusk, factory workers walked to their cars in tight groups, and an oppressive cloud of paranoia settled over every neighborhood block. Detective Thomas Miller, the lead investigator assigned to the case, stood in the freezing wind of the crime scene day after day, staring at the empty driver's seat of Clara's sedan, his mind grinding against the total absence of physical indicators. The case file grew thicker by the hour with false leads, frantic sightings from truck stops 300 miles away, and anonymous letters filled with schizophrenic rants, but the core of the mystery remained an impenetrable block of ice, resisting every conventional method of 20th century policing. As the weeks dragged into a bitter spring, the investigation hit a series of agonizing walls, each one more demoralizing than the last. Clara's inner circle was dissected under the intense glare of the interrogation room, her fiancé, her co-workers, the disgruntled customer who had made a scene at the bank the previous week. But every alibi held under pressure, every timeline checked out with maddening precision. It was as if the predator had possessed an intimate knowledge of the police department's blind spots, executing the crime at the exact geographical midpoint between two separate radio dispatch zones where patrols were notoriously thin. The realization that they were dealing with someone highly organized, patient, and completely detached from the typical profile of an impulsive criminal sent a deep shudder through the precinct, forcing Miller to confront the terrifying possibility that the killer was someone who wore a uniform of respectability during the day. By the second anniversary of the vanishing, the active hunt had slowed to a procedural crawl, the daily briefings replaced by a quiet, brooding frustration that settled over the detective bureau like dust. The high-profile headlines vanished from the front pages, replaced by smaller, generic updates buried in the back sections of the local papers, until the name Clara Vance became synonymous with the concept of the absolute unsolved. Miller refused to let the file go to the basement archive, keeping the grainy, black-and-white photograph of the young woman taped to the inside of his desk drawer, a constant, silent accusation that reminded him of his own limitations and the failure of his department to protect its own citizens. He spent his late nights rereading the original statements, cross-checking phone logs from long-defunct telecom networks, and staring at the sky, haunted by the intimate knowledge that a monster was walking the very same streets, breathing the same air, completely unbothered by the passage of time. The economic decline of Iron Ridge over the next 2 decades further buried the case beneath layers of municipal decay. As factories closed their gates, neighborhoods emptied out, and the memory of 1999 became a ghost story told by elders to children who had never known a time before the panic. The old overpass was blocked off with concrete barriers, left to rust into a skeletal monument of a tragedy that the town had never truly processed, its name permanently linked to the concept of the predator's playground. A generation of children grew up under the unspoken rules of the Vance legacy. Never stop your car under the dark spans, never travel alone after the factory whistles blow, and never trust a stranger who approaches with an easy smile. The trauma had modified the DNA of the community, turning a once vibrant industrial hub into a watchful, suspicious enclave where the fear was not an emotion, but an environmental baseline. But the physical reality of the crime scene had left behind a microscopic inheritance, a silent witness that had been resting in the deep freeze of the evidence vault since the final hours of the 20th century. When the initial team processed Clara's vehicle, they had recovered a tiny, nearly invisible trace of biological material from the steering wheel column, a minuscule transfer of skin cells left by the abductor when he reached across the seat to turn off the headlights. In 1999, the technology required to extract a viable genetic profile from such a microscopic sample simply did not exist, rendering the piece of evidence a useless, ambiguous data point logged on a yellowing index card. The sample sat in darkness for 27 years, surviving multiple facility moves, refrigeration failures, and administrative shakeups, waiting for the timeline of human innovation to finally catch up with the reality of the crime. The turning point arrived with the sudden, violent force of a forensic leap that redefined the architecture of modern criminal justice. A specialized cold case unit, armed with the newly stabilized protocols of investigative genetic genealogy and high-throughput DNA sequencing arrays, pulled the Clara Vance file from the oblivion of the archive cabinets. They didn't see a stale mystery. They saw a highly concentrated biological map that had been preserved against all odds. The degraded genetic material was fed into state-of-the-art sequencing machines, which reconstructed the broken base pairs with the clinical precision of a computer compiling corrupted code. Within weeks, the laboratory did what 3 decades of human intuition could not. They pulled a pristine, unassailable, and entirely unique male DNA profile from the steering wheel smudge, transforming the Phantom of Iron Ridge into a concrete sequence of biological markers. The profile was not run through the traditional law enforcement databases, which only contained convicted felons, but through the massive, decentralized networks of consumer genealogy platforms, a digital ocean containing the family trees of millions of ordinary citizens. The algorithms began to map the connections, tracking distant cousins, second-generation aunties, and forgotten marriages, slowly narrowing the focus of the search from a continent down to a single bloodline rooted in the state's history. The data began to cluster with terrifying accuracy around a specific family tree that had resided in the county adjacent to Iron Ridge since the early 1970s. The investigators watched the digital lines converge on a screen in a windowless command center, their breath catching as the system stripped away the anonymity of the past, piece by agonizing piece, until only one name remained at the absolute center of the genetic web. The name was Raymond Kane, a 58-year-old heavy equipment operator who had lived a life of aggressive, mundane normalcy, less than 20 miles from the overpass where Clara Vance had vanished. He had no criminal record, no violent history, no red flags in his employment logs. He was a man who paid his taxes, attended neighborhood barbecues, and worked the night shifts at the gravel quarry without ever raising a single suspicion. The realization that the notorious 1999 predator had been hiding in plain sight, shielded by the absolute banality of his existence, sent a surge of adrenaline through the elite arrest team as they finalized the tactical logistics of the capture. They were not chasing a cinematic villain with a secret lair. They were going to pull a grandfather from his breakfast table, forcing him to face the biological signature he had left behind in a moments-long interception 27 years prior. The execution of the warrant was a silent, swift operational strike carried out in the gray light of a Tuesday dawn, the quiet suburban streets suddenly flooded by unmarked black SUVs that moved with the synchronized precision of a military unit. There were no sirens, no megaphone demands, no dramatic standoffs. The entry team breached the front door with a heavy ram, their suppressed weapons raised, their voices a low, intense roar that filled the small house before the occupant could even process the rupture of his routine. Kane was found in the kitchen, a coffee mug halfway to his lips, his eyes widening in a sudden, animal panic as 300 pounds of tactical gear slammed him into the linoleum floor. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sharp, definitive snap, the sound of a 27-year circle finally closing, the sound of the notorious 1999 cold case being violently wrenched out of the past and into the absolute clarity of modern justice. As the suspect was led out to the waiting vehicle, his head bowed, his hands secured behind his back with heavy plastic zip ties, the neighbors began to step onto their porches, their faces frozen in a collective expression of unvarnished disbelief. The news spread through the digital pathways of Iron Ridge like a wildfire through dry brush, the headlines updating with frantic speed. Arrest made in Vance case. Forensic breakthrough ends decades of terror. Raymond Kane in custody. The town experienced a collective moment of psychological vertigo. The phantom that had haunted their childhoods, the boogeyman used to keep them inside after dark, was a real man with a mortgage, a bad back, and a routine that included buying gas at the local station every Thursday morning. The illusion of safety that they had spent decades rebuilding was shattered once again, replaced by the disturbing realization that the architecture of evil is entirely ordinary. Inside the interrogation room at the county precinct, the atmosphere was a heavy, airless vacuum of psychological warfare. Kane sat at the steel table, his initial panic replaced by a cold, stubborn stoicism, his eyes fixed on the blank wall as the detectives laid out the fruits of the forensic leap. They didn't play games, they didn't raise their voices, and they didn't offer deals. They simply placed the high-definition charts of the DNA comparison directly in front of him, the statistical probability of the match written out in a string of zeros that stretched across the page. The genetic markers were a biological confession that he could not deny, an unerasable digital fingerprint that linked his body directly to the interior of Clara Vance's car on that freezing December night in 1999. The old detective who had come out of retirement to witness the moment watched from behind the two-way mirror, his hands trembling as he saw the first fracture appear in the suspect's iron composure. The confession, when it finally arrived, did not come with the dramatic tears of a penitent man, but with the flat, clinical indifference of an accountant closing a long-overdue ledger. Kane spoke in a low, monotonic drone, detailing the mechanics of the abduction with a level of precision that proved the memory had been preserved in his mind with perfect clarity. He described how he had stalked Clara for 3 weeks, learning her schedule, her route home from the bank, and the exact moment she would pass beneath the isolated span of the railway overpass. He had staged a vehicle breakdown in the midnight fog, utilizing her own compassion as a weapon to get her to roll down her window before he smashed the glass, neutralized her with a chemical sedative, and transferred her to the bed of his pickup truck within a 90-second window that left the environment completely undisturbed. He didn't offer a grand motive, no philosophical justification for the destruction of a young life. He simply stated that he wanted to know what it felt like to possess absolute control over another human being's existence. He led the investigators to a remote, abandoned strip mine 40 miles north of the town, a desolate wasteland of coal slag and choked vegetation that had been bypassed by developers for decades. There, beneath a massive concrete slab that had once formed the foundation of a long-collapsed processing plant, the forensic recovery teams began the slow, agonizing process of excavation. Working with hand shovels, brushes, and ground-penetrating radar, they peeled back 27 years of earth and industrial debris, their faces grim under the glare of portable halogen floodlights as the soil began to give up its terrible, long-held secret. The discovery of the skeletal remains, confirmed within hours by dental records and subsequent rapid DNA analysis, provided the final, devastating punctuation mark to the investigation. Clara Vance had been found, her final resting place no longer a matter of agonizing speculation for the family that had spent a lifetime staring at an empty horizon. The scene at the strip mine was a somber, silent theater of closure. The investigators stood in a circle, their heads bowed as the black recovery bag was lifted from the earth, the rain beginning to fall over the coal slag like a delayed benediction. The beast had been dragged from his cave. The Valley of the Shadow had been illuminated by the unblinking beam of forensic science, and the cold case that had defined the modern history of Iron Ridge was officially over, leaving behind a town that was finally, mercifully, allowed to begin the process of mourning. But the resolution of the legal case did not instantly heal the deep, structural fractures that the crime had carved into the soul of the community. The local courthouse became a site of intense emotional friction during the pre-trial hearings, as hundreds of citizens crammed into the gallery every morning just to see the face of the man who had stolen their collective peace. The contrast between the gravity of the crime and the pathetic, aging reality of the defendant was an intellectual insult that many found impossible to process. He was just an old man with a cane, coughing into a handkerchief, defended by state-appointed attorneys who argued about procedural technicalities and the chain of custody from 1999. The families of the victims sat in the front row, their eyes locked on the back of Kane's neck, their expressions a mix of profound exhaustion and cold, unwavering resolve to see the process through to the final gavel. The trial itself was less of a legal battle and more of a public autopsy of a 30-year deception. The prosecution systematically built a wall of evidence that was entirely impenetrable, utilizing the forensic leap to connect every piece of circumstantial data, the work schedules, the old truck ownership records, the geographical coordinates of the burial site, into a single, devastating narrative of premeditated murder. The defense's attempts to sow doubt regarding the age of the DNA sample and the potential for laboratory contamination were brushed aside by the testimony of international experts who confirmed that the computational accuracy of the genealogy mapping was flawless. The jurors, ordinary citizens from the very same streets that had lived under the shadow of the overpass, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts within less than 3 hours of deliberation, a swift, definitive stamp of judgment that resonated through the courthouse halls like a clap of thunder. The sentencing phase brought the final, crushing weight of the law down upon Raymond Cain, as the judge sentenced him to life, without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the remainder of his natural life would be spent in the sterile, airless concrete of a maximum security penitentiary. The courtroom erupted into a quiet, tearful release of tension as the words were spoken, the family members embracing each other with a desperate, heavy relief that had been denied to them for an entire generation. Cain was led away through the side doors, his chains rattling against the linoleum, his face blank as he disappeared into the machinery of the state, a modern predator finally neutralized by the very technology he had assumed would never exist during his night under the railway overpass. Yet, as the media vans packed up their satellite dishes and the town of Iron Ridge returned to the quiet routine of its post-industrial existence, the true residual cost of the 1999 cold case became undeniable. The overpass still stood, its iron girders rusting under the winter sky, a physical reminder that while the killer had been captured, the decades of fear could not be unlived. The children who had grown up under the rules of the Vance legacy were now adults with their own families, carrying the deep-seated habits of suspicion and hypervigilance into the next generation. The town had been cured of its mystery, but the scar remained, a long, jagged line through the history of the county that would always remind them of the thinness of the line between the mundane safety of everyday life and the terrifying, unpredictable reality of the dark. The final image that lingers in the mind of the community is not the face of the killer in his orange jumpsuit, nor the technical charts of the forensic geneticists, but the simple, quiet memorial service held at the railway overpass 3 weeks after the trial ended. Hundreds of citizens gathered in the freezing rain, placing white roses along the concrete barriers and lighting candles that flickered against the dark iron above. Clara Vance was no longer a name on a missing person poster, no longer a cold case file gathering dust in a precinct basement. She was a daughter of Iron Ridge who had finally been brought home, her memory cleansed of the horror of her exit and restored to the dignity of a life that had been cherished. The silence that settled over the overpass that night was different, no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an unresolved nightmare, but the clean, deep, and final quiet of a peace that had been hard-won through the relentless, unyielding march of justice. The echoes of that final gavel in the Iron Ridge County Courthouse did not instantly dissolve the invisible, toxic fog that had poisoned the region's soil since the winter of 1999. A modern town does not simply reset its psychological baseline because a piece of paper has been stamped with a final judgment, nor does a community instantly unlearn nearly 3 decades of systematic, defensive caution. The revelation that Raymond Cain was the singular architect of Clara Vance's erasure sent a secondary, sharper wave of structural shock through the municipal fabric of the entire county. People were forced to look backward through the lens of a newly exposed truth, reevaluating every mundane interaction, every passing nod, and every shared conversation they had experienced with a man who had successfully performed the role of an unremarkable citizen while a skeleton lay beneath a concrete slab 40 miles to the north. The horror was no longer localized to the dark, skeletal span of the old railway overpass. It had expanded to inhabit the everyday spaces of the neighborhood, the local hardware store, the diner, the gravel quarry where the predator had spent his working hours operating heavy machinery with the same hands that had shattered a young woman's life. The investigative files, which had been transformed from a chaotic mountain of dead ends into a pristine, digital repository of biological certainty, revealed a chilling timeline of calculate deception that extended far beyond the single night of the abduction. In the weeks following the arrest, the specialized cold case unit began a meticulous, forensic audit of Cain's entire adult life, picking through his personal history with the hyper-focused intensity of historical archaeologists. They discovered that his performance of normalcy was a highly conscious, defensive strategy designed to exploit the specific limitations of 20th century law enforcement. He had deliberately chosen a career that allowed him to move across county lines without attracting attention, using the heavy, anonymous presence of utility trucks and commercial equipment as a physical shield. The detectives found evidence that he had monitored the police scanners for months after the 1999 vanishing, sitting in his dark living room, listening to the frustrated radio dispatches of an agency that was running out of ideas and out of time, his silence a calculated insult to the memory of the victim. For the older generation of residents who had lived through the immediate, white-hot panic of the initial search, the details of the confession were a bitter, corrosive revelation that reopened wounds they had spent a lifetime trying to cauterize. They recalled the town hall meetings where the community had screamed for answers, the localized witch hunts that had destroyed the reputations of innocent drifters, and the pervasive, heavy atmosphere of mutual suspicion that had turned lifelong neighbors into potential monsters. The knowledge that the killer had been less than 20 miles away, watching the same news broadcasts, buying the same groceries, and living within the same social ecosystem, was an intellectual violation that left many in a state of chronic, unvarnished anger. The town realized that their collective paranoia had been both entirely justified and completely misdirected. The danger had not been an external, nomadic phantom passing through the night, but a stable, fully integrated component of their own community landscape. The internal psychological landscape of the Iron Ridge Police Department underwent an equally severe, institutional realignment as the reality of the forensic leap settled into the daily routine of the precinct. The active detectives, many of whom were toddlers when Clara Vance's sedan was found humming beneath the overpass, looked at the case file not as a historic relic, but as an active, warning monument regarding the dangers of investigative complacency. The yellowing index cards, the original Polaroids of the crime scene, and the typed, carbon copy statements from 1999 were digitized and mounted in the Training Academy as a case study in the architecture of persistence. The department formalized a new standard for evidence preservation, recognizing that the microscopic debris left behind at a modern crime scene is a message addressed to a future generation of scientists, a message that must be protected from the degradation of moisture, heat, and human carelessness until the technology arrives to decode its contents. Outside the walls of the precinct, the family of Clara Vance began the slow, agonizing process of dismantling the shrine of uncertainty they had lived in for 27 years. For nearly 3 decades, their home had been a museum of frozen time, her bedroom left exactly as it was on that December morning, her clothes still hanging in the closet, her unfinished letters preserved in plastic sleeves like sacred texts. The discovery of her remains at the abandoned strip mine forced a violent, necessary confrontation with the absolute finality of death, stripping away the thin, agonizing comfort of the maybe that had sustained them through the darkest nights of the new millennium. They were forced to relearn how to speak her name without the accompanying weight of a question mark, transitioning from the frantic, public role of advocates for the missing into the quiet, private reality of permanent mourning. The regional media, which had spent weeks exploiting the sensationalist aspects of the arrest, slowly began to pivot toward a more somber, analytical style of reporting, documenting the sociological scars that the 1999 cold case had left on the infrastructure of Iron Ridge. Documentary crews walked the empty streets of the industrial sectors, filming the rusted girders of the railway overpass and interviewing historians about how a single, 90-second act of violence could alter the development of a town for an entire generation. The consensus was clear. The Vance vanishing had acted as an economic and cultural break on the community, accelerating the flight of families from the city center and turning the evening hours into a time of enforced, defensive isolation. The town had been held hostage by a secret, its growth stunted by an invisible terrain of fear that had made investors and new residents wary of a place where a young woman could disappear from a major roadway without a trace. As the winter of 2026 began to deepen, casting a hard, frozen glare over the post-industrial landscape of the county, the legal teams began the complex preparation for the formal asset forfeiture and civil litigation phases that inevitably follow a high-profile criminal conviction. The state moved to seize Raymond Cain's property, including the modest suburban house where he had spent his decades of freedom and the accounts he had accumulated while working his night shifts at the quarry. For the community, these legal maneuvers were a necessary, symbolic stripping of the predator's legacy, a statement that the law would not allow a man to retain the material fruits of a life built on a foundation of unpunished slaughter. The civil proceedings became a public ledger of accountability, forcing the exposure of every financial and personal choice Cain had made since 1999, ensuring that his family name would be permanently associated with the concepts of ruin and restitution. The site of the discovery, the remote, scarred landscape of the abandoned strip mine 40 miles north, became a place of grim, academic interest for forensic schools and law enforcement agencies across the country. Specialized recovery teams returned to the coal slag to document the exact taphonomic conditions that had preserved Clara's remains beneath the concrete slab for 27 years, utilizing the data to refine the predictive models used to locate clandestine graves in other unresolved cases. The desolate, windswept mine became a classroom, a sterile environment where the mechanics of hidden violence were studied under a clinical light. The investigators who had stood in the rain as the recovery bag was lifted from the soil spoke to groups of students about the responsibility of the ground, emphasizing that the earth always retains the signature of human intervention, and that the job of the modern investigator is simply to possess the patience and the tools required to read the soil's testimony. In the neighborhoods of Iron Ridge, the slow dissolution of the historic fear was marked by small, almost imperceptible changes in the habits of the citizenry. A local business association funded the installation of high-intensity LED lighting strings beneath the old railway overpass, banishing the deep, historic shadows that had made the span a place of avoidance for 27 years. For the first time since 1999, people began to park their vehicles near the overpass during the evening hours, their movements no longer dictated by the frantic, internal countdown that had driven them to flee the site before the midnight fog rolled in. The physical reclamation of the crime scene was a crucial, nonverbal declaration of victory by the community over the memory of the predator. They were actively rewriting the geography of their town, converting a monument of terror into an ordinary, well-lit component of the municipal grid. Despite these physical improvements, the psychological residue of the Vance legacy remained an active factor in the lives of the adults who had been raised under the strict, defensive protocols of the unsolved era. Parents found themselves struggling to relax the hyper-vigilant standards they had enforced on their own children, their internal alarms still triggered by a delayed arrival, a missed phone call, or an unfamiliar vehicle idling near the edge of a driveway. The habits of a generation are not erased by a press conference or a judicial order. They are deeply grooved paths in the brain that require years of safe, uneventful routine to smooth over. The town recognized that they were living in a period of transition, a fragile, intermediate state where the boogeyman had been removed from the woods, but the habit of watching the tree lean for movement remained an instinctive, default reaction. The academic community took a profound interest in this phase of Iron Ridge's history, with sociologists and trauma specialists launching a long-term study to document the half-life of fear in communities recovered from chronic, unresolved criminal trauma. They distributed surveys, conducted interviews in the community centers, and analyzed local health data to track how the resolution of the 1999 cold case affected the overall stress levels, economic confidence, and social cohesion of the populace. The initial findings confirmed that the arrest provided an immediate, measurable lift in the psychological well-being of the older residents, but it also revealed a complex layer of survival guilt among those who realized they had lived peaceful lives in the shadow of a horror that had remained frozen in the earth less than an hour away. The study became a landmark piece of research, illustrating that the closure of a cold case is not a single point in time, but a long, slow-motion wave of societal realignment that touches every generation differently. In the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the County Forensic Laboratory, the technicians who had participated in the forensic leap continued to refine the genetic profile that had broken the case, utilizing it to test new, emerging software platforms designed to identify even more distant familial connections. They recognized that the Raymond Kane match was a proof of concept that would unlock hundreds of other forgotten files in vaults across the state, and they worked with a renewed, intense sense of historical purpose. The laboratory became a beacon of technological progress, a place where the air was thick with the silent, humming energy of supercomputers processing billions of base pairs of human code. The technicians felt a deep, professional pride in their connection to the Iron Ridge Resolution, knowing that their work had provided the definitive, unassailable foundation upon which the entire legal architecture of the prosecution had been built. As the first anniversary of the arrest approached, the town council began discussions regarding the creation of a permanent, living memorial to Clara Vance within the Central Park of Iron Ridge, a space that would focus not on the mystery of her exit, but on the enduring strength of the community that had refused to let her memory fade into the dark. The planned memorial was designed as an open, sunlit pavilion, a place for musical performances, civic gatherings, and quiet reflection, completely free from the macabre, true crime imagery that had dominated the public discourse for 27 years. The project was funded entirely through small, private donations from local citizens, an extraordinary display of communal solidarity that demonstrated the deep, lingering need to provide a dignified, beautiful period to the long, irregular sentence that had been imposed on the town in 1999. The old detective, Thomas Miller, who had kept the black-and-white photograph of Clara in his desk through the long, barren decades of his active service, became a frequent visitor to the construction site of the pavilion. He would stand near the edge of the foundations, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his heavy winter coat, his eyes watching the workers pour the fresh concrete and set the stone pillars into the earth. For Miller, the building of the pavilion was the final, tangible proof that his life's work had not been an exercise in futility. He had carried the weight of his failure for 27 years, his mind trapped in a perpetual loop of that freezing December night beneath the overpass. But now, as he watched the light hit the fresh stone, he could feel the grip of the past slowly, mercifully loosening. He was no longer the custodian of a tragedy. He was a witness to a reclamation. The narrative of the 1999 cold case, now fully stripped of its ambiguity and its capacity to terrify, was officially integrated into the historical archives of the State Historical Society, a permanent record of a dark era that had ended with a triumph of human intelligence and technological resolve. The files were preserved not as a source of sensationalized entertainment, but as an essential chapter in the history of the region's development, an objective account of how an industrial community had weathered a prolonged crisis of security and emerged with its core values intact. The record was a testament to the fact that while a predator can alter the history of a town for a generation, he cannot possess it forever. His crime is a temporary distortion of a landscape that will always, eventually, return to a state of balance under the steady, eroding march of justice. The winter wind that blew through the iron girders of the railway overpass at the close of 2026 carried a completely different quality than the freezing, stagnant air of 1999. It was an active, cleansing wind that swept the remaining debris from the asphalt of Route 9, moving through the newly illuminated spans without encountering the heavy, suffocating silence of an unresolved nightmare. The town of Iron Ridge had settled into its new reality. A reality where the boogeyman was an old man in a prison uniform, where the victim was resting in a named grave beneath a canopy of flowers, and where the citizens could look at the dark spaces of their county without seeing the outline of a monster. The long, agonizing march toward the truth was over, leaving behind a community that was scarred, yes, but also entirely whole, forever anchored by the knowledge that the light of justice, though sometimes delayed by the limits of human knowledge, is an inevitable, unstoppable force that will always, eventually, find its way home. The structural transformation of Iron Ridge, which had begun in the sterile white glare of the genetic genealogy laboratory, finally reached its institutional crucible within the austere, wood-paneled walls of the County Superior Court as the calendar moved into the spring of 2027. The pretrial proceedings had concluded. The procedural objections raised by the defense regarding the historical chain of custody had been systematically defeated, and the community was now thrust into the raw, unvarnished reality of a capital murder trial. The atmosphere inside the gallery was not one of sensational spectacle, but of a deep, collective gravity, an air so thick with tension that the simple act of the bailiff opening the heavy oak doors each morning felt like the breaching of a sealed tomb. Every seat was occupied by individuals whose lives had been directly or indirectly bent out of shape by the events of 1999. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a living wall of human history, waiting to watch the state deploy its newly forged forensic weapons against the man who had assumed his secret was safe beneath 40 miles of coal slag and concrete. Raymond Kane sat at the defense table, his physical presence completely stripped of the rugged, operating room authority he had possessed while commanding heavy machinery at the gravel quarry. In the clinical, unforgiving light of the courtroom, he appeared as a remarkably ordinary, aging man, his shoulders slightly hunched beneath a gray suit that seemed a size too large, his fingers tracing random, microscopic patterns on the polished surface of the table. He did not look at the gallery, nor did he look toward the front row where Clara Vance's family sat in a motionless, unbreakable line of silent accusation. The calculated stoicism he had maintained during his initial interrogation had hardened into a flat, defensive mask, the facial geometry of a man who realized that he was no longer fighting against the shifting, fallible memories of human witnesses, but against the unyielding, immutable data of his own cellular signature. The opening statement by the chief prosecutor was a masterclass in narrative precision, deliberately designed to strip the case of any remaining true crime mythology and anchor it firmly in the soil of empirical fact. She walked to the center of the well, her voice carrying a steady, clear resonance that banished the low hum of the courtroom's ventilation system, and began to reconstruct the timeline of December 14, 1999, not as a remote historical legend, but as a sequence of physical events that had left an indelible mark on the universe. She described Clara Vance not as an abstract symbol of a cold case, but as a real person, a 24-year-old woman with specific dreams, a family that cherished her, and a routine that had been violently intercepted by a calculated, predatory calculation. The prosecutor did not use hyperbole. She relied on the stark, chronological alignment of work records, weather reports from that freezing night, and the exact coordinates of the old railway overpass to demonstrate that the crime was an act of cold, deliberate strategy. When the state called its first witness, the retired patrol officer who had discovered Clara's humming vehicle beneath the overpass 28 years prior, the courtroom experienced a profound, collective shift backward in time. The officer, his voice cracking slightly with the weight of decades of accumulated regret, described the scene exactly as he had found it. The driver's door flung open to the biting winter wind, the headlights cutting uselessly through the midnight fog, and the keys dangling from the ignition like a steel pendulum. The prosecution projected the original 1999 crime scene photographs onto a massive digital screen behind the judicial bench, the grainy, high-contrast images illuminating the dark wood of the courtroom with a stark, ghostly clarity. For the younger jurors, it was an introduction to a lost world of analog policing. For the older residents in the gallery, it was a violent, visceral confrontation with the exact moment their town's innocence had been shattered. The trial moved from historical reconstruction to forensic assault on the third day, as the prosecution began to introduce the technical pioneers who had executed the forensic leap. The lead molecular biologist from the state forensic facility took the stand, carrying herself with the detached, clinical authority of a scientist presenting a breakthrough to an academic peer review. She walked the jury through the complex mechanics of low-copy number DNA recovery, utilizing high-definition diagrams to illustrate how a microscopic smudge of skin cells left on the steering wheel column in 1999 had been protected from total degradation by the unique, sheltered microclimate of the vehicle's interior electronics. She explained how the modern sequencing arrays had coaxed the severely fragmented genetic strands into revealing a complete, unassailable genomic profile, turning what had been an invisible, useless trace into a pristine, digital fingerprint containing billions of unique data points. The cross-examination by the defense was a desperate, aggressive attempt to exploit the generational gap in technology, focusing intensely on the potential for cross-contamination during the 27 years the steering wheel sample had sat in the evidence vault. The lead defense attorney hammered at the record logs from the mid-2000s, pointing to facility relocations, administrative shifts, and the lack of automated tracking systems during the early years of the warehouse storage. He attempted to plant the seed of doubt that the biological material could have been introduced by a careless technician or an ungloved handler long after the vehicle had been processed. But the scientist remained entirely unshakable, pointing to the specific, localized nature of the cellular deposition and the presence of ancient environmental contaminants embedded within the sample itself. A microscopic matrix of 1999 coal dust and industrial grease that could only have been formed at the exact geographical coordinates of the Iron Ridge Railway overpass during the town's manufacturing era. The emotional and structural climax of the forensic presentation arrived with the testimony of the investigative genetic genealogist, the data architect who had tracked the killer through the digital branches of consumer ancestry networks. He explained to the jury how a human family tree functions as a natural, biological ledger, where every individual carries pieces of code that link them irrevocably to a wider matrix of relatives. He demonstrated how the unknown profile recovered from Clara's car had matched with several distant second cousins who had uploaded their data to public platforms, allowing the investigative team to construct a massive, multi-generational web of descent that converged with mathematical certainty on a single branch of the Kane family lineage. The genealogist's testimony stripped away the last remaining illusion of anonymity. He showed that the killer had not been hunted down by the instincts of a detective, but had been betrayed by the very biology of his own relatives, his identity pulled out of the dark by the collective data of ordinary citizens. As the state's evidence mounted day after day, the defense table began to feel more like an island of isolation within the crowded courtroom. The secondary witnesses introduced by the prosecution systematically demolished any possibility of an alibi or alternative explanation for Kane's movements in December of 1999. They introduced historical employment logs from the gravel quarry, showing that Kane had been assigned to an independent night patrol of the heavy equipment units along Route 9 on the exact date of the vanishing, a position that gave him unrestricted, unmonitored access to the highway system during the midnight hours. They presented historical maintenance records for his personal pickup truck, showing that he had purchased a replacement windshield and heavy chemical cleaning agents from an out-of-town supplier less than 36 hours after Clara disappeared, a detail that mapped perfectly with the mechanics of the forced entry and abduction described in his confession. The defense's strategy, when it finally ran its course, was a hollow, procedural defense that focused almost entirely on trying to bifurcate the identity of the defendant. They did not call Kane to the stand, a tactical choice that surprised no one given the ironclad nature of his recorded confession, but instead called character witnesses from his modern, suburban life. They brought forward neighbors who spoke of his willingness to clear snow from their driveways, co-workers who described him as a reliable, quiet operator of machinery, and relatives who painted a picture of an aging grandfather who lived for backyard barbecues and Sunday afternoon television. It was a calculated attempt to create a psychological disconnect in the minds of the jury, to make them believe that the person who had stalked and erased Clara Vance in 1999 was an entirely separate, alien entity from the frail old man sitting before them with a cane. But the prosecution's closing argument shattered this artificial separation with the sudden, devastating force of a physical blow. The chief prosecutor stood before the jury box, her eyes tracking the face of each juror, and reminded them that the passage of time is a luxury enjoyed only by the living. She pointed toward Raymond Kane and declared that the normalcy of his middle age was a direct theft, a life bought with the currency of 30 years of freedom that belonged by right to Clara Vance. She reminded the jury that every family dinner he had attended, every peaceful night of sleep he had enjoyed, and every dollar he had earned was a comfort built directly on top of the concrete slab in the abandoned strip mine 40 miles to the north. She demanded that the law refuse to recognize the validity of a peaceful retirement that had been purchased with the blood of an innocent 24-year-old woman, calling upon them to return a verdict that would finally restore the moral equilibrium of the county. The jury's deliberation was an intense, compact period of collective concentration that lasted less than 3 hours, a duration that signaled a complete, unassailable consensus among the 12 ordinary citizens of Iron Ridge. When the buzzer sounded to announce that a verdict had been reached, a dead, Breathless silence descended over the entire courthouse complex, the crowds in the corridors freezing in place as the doors to the courtroom were unlocked for the final time. The gallery was packed to its structural limits, the air thin and hot with the collective respiration of a community waiting for its historical sentence to be passed. Clara's family stood linked by their hands, their faces pale but steady, their eyes fixed on the judicial bench as the judge took a seat and received the paperwork from the jury foreman. The reading of the verdict was a sequence of monosyllabic declarations that hit the room like a series of clean, precise rifle shots. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of carjacking. Guilty of first-degree, premeditated murder. With each word spoken by the foreman, the heavy, suffocating pressure that had held Iron Ridge hostage for 27 years began to violently decompress. There were no cheers, no outbursts of theatrical celebration from the gallery. Instead, the room filled with the deep, collective sound of a populace exhaling, a low, rhythmic groan of release accompanied by the quiet, unstoppable weeping of the Vance family. Raymond Kane received the judgment without a single visible twitch of his features, his face remaining a gray, immobile mask as the judge formally entered the conviction into the permanent record of the state, ensuring that the predator of 1999 would never again draw a breath of free air. The sentencing phase, which followed 48 hours later, provided the final, administrative seal on the historical correction. The judge did not mince his words. He looked down from the bench at the convicted man and described his actions as a systematic violation of the human contract, a crime that had not only ended a promising life but had actively poisoned the development of an entire region for a generation. He sentenced Kane to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ordering that he be transferred immediately to the maximum security wing of the state penitentiary, where his existence would be reduced to the sterile, unbending dimensions of an 8x10 concrete cell. As the shackles were adjusted around his ankles and wrists, their metallic clinking echoing sharply against the wood panels, Kane was led through the side door of the courtroom, disappearing into the institutional machinery of the Department of Corrections, never to be seen in the county again. The immediate aftermath of the trial's conclusion was marked by a sudden, total evaporation of the media apparatus that had turned Iron Ridge into a center of global scrutiny for months. The satellite trucks packed away their massive dishes, the reporters filed their final digital dispatches, and the temporary news desks were dismantled, leaving the town to inhabit the quiet world it had finally won back from the past. For the residents, this sudden return to privacy was a profound, almost disorienting experience. For 27 years, their identity had been intertwined with the concepts of mystery, vulnerability, and unresolved danger. They were now forced to learn how to exist as an ordinary municipality, a town where the history was no longer an active trap, but a finished record preserved in the climate-controlled archives of the county. The physical landscape of Iron Ridge began to adapt to this new era of clarity with a rapidity that surprised many municipal planners. The town council approved an emergency budget allocation to completely revitalize the area surrounding the old railway overpass, transforming what had been a site of chronic avoidance into an active, welcoming corridor of urban development. The rusted steel girders were sandblasted and repainted in bright, modern tones. The concrete barriers that had blocked Route 9 were removed, reopening the historic transit link between the industrial and residential sectors, and a massive network of public security cameras and high-illumination lighting was integrated into the span. The reclamation of the crime scene was a physical necessity for the town's survival, an explicit statement that the geography of Iron Ridge belonged to its citizens, not to the memories of the monsters who had passed through it. For the Vance family, the conclusion of the legal process allowed them to finally retreat from the exhausting, public role of professional mourners and enter the quiet, sacred space of private remembrance. They organized a small, private burial service at the local cemetery, placing Clara's remains beneath a simple marble headstone that bore her name, her dates of birth and death, and a single, definitive phrase, "Finally home." The service was entirely free from the cameras of journalists or the presence of curious onlookers. It was an intimate, domestic gathering of those who had loved her as a person, rather than those who had studied her as a case file. As the casket was lowered into the earth under a clear, pale spring sky, the family realized that the forensic leap had done something far more important than securing a conviction. It had given them back their daughter, rescuing her from the cold anonymity of the strip mine and restoring her to the dignified, continuous memory of her bloodline. The old detective, Thomas Miller, who had spent his entire post-retirement life waiting for this season of resolution, found himself sitting on a bench in the newly opened park near the railway overpass as the summer of 2027 began to warm the county. He looked at the cars passing smoothly beneath the illuminated iron span, his mind no longer trapped in the freezing midnight fog of 1999. The photograph of Clara Vance was no longer in his possession. He had presented it to her mother on the day of the verdict, a symbolic return of the custody of her memory. Miller felt a deep, clean exhaustion that was entirely separate from the grinding frustration of his active years, the heavy, satisfying fatigue of a craftsman who had finally put down his tools after completing a monument that would outlast his own lifespan. The narrative of the notorious 1999 cold case, now officially categorized as solved and quieted, passed into the permanent teaching collection of the National Law Enforcement Academies as a definitive paradigm shift in the history of investigation. It stood as an unassailable proof of concept that the passage of decades is no longer an absolute defense against the law, and that the molecular signature left behind by a predator is a time capsule that will always, eventually, explode in his hands. The town of Iron Ridge moved forward into the middle decades of the century, no longer marked by the shadow of the overpass, but fortified by the knowledge that they had survived their longest night, their collective identity forever anchored by the relentless, inevitable, and ultimately triumphant nature of the truth. The shifting of the calendar into the deep summer of 2027 did not slow the momentum of Iron Ridge's institutional rebirth. Rather, it signaled the beginning of a vast, bureaucratic and cultural normalization. The trial of Raymond Kane was a matter of historic record. His life sentence was locked behind the unbending stone of the state penitentiary, and the legal files had been moved from the active desks of the homicide unit into the climate-controlled vaults of the county archives. Yet, for the detectives who had lived inside the mechanics of the 1999 cold case for nearly 3 decades, the administrative closure was merely the prologue to a deeper, more complicated process of professional and personal recalibration. They were forced to inhabit an environment where the primary organizing principle of their daily routine, the constant, obsessive chase for a nomadic phantom, had been suddenly and completely extracted from the system, leaving behind a quiet, almost disorienting vacuum that challenged their very understanding of their roles as protectors of the community. The specialized cold case unit, which had risen to international prominence following the execution of the forensic leap, found itself transformed overnight into a permanent regional center for genetic genealogy and advanced biological evidence retention. The small, cramped offices on Elm Street were completely overhauled, the vintage filing cabinets and grease-stained evidence logs replaced by a state-of-the-art computational biology suite that functioned with the silent, pressurized efficiency of a medical research foundation. Investigators from neighboring states and federal agencies traveled to Iron Ridge not to offer assistance, but to study the administrative architecture that had allowed a local department to maintain the physical integrity of a microscopic cell sample across 27 years of shifting municipal budgets and facility relocations. The Iron Ridge method became a standardized curriculum, forcing a fundamental rewriting of property room protocols across the country, establishing a new baseline where every piece of debris collected at a fresh crime scene was treated as a message addressed to a future scientist whose tools did not yet exist. For the active investigators who had logged hundreds of hours of overtime during the final, high-velocity weeks leading to Kane's capture, the transition into the routine operations of ordinary policing was a jarring psychological adjustment. They found themselves dealing with petty larcenies, traffic disputes, and municipal zoning violations, the mundane, everyday friction of a small post-industrial city, while their minds were still processing the clinical horrors of the abandoned strip mine and the chillingly detached phrasing of the predator's confession. The lead detective of the cold case unit often sat at his new digital terminal late into the evening, staring at the empty field where the Clara Vance file had sat for a generation, his fingers typing out random search queries into old databases out of a residual, muscular habit that refused to recognize the finality of the courtroom verdict. They had won the war. They had dragged the beast out of the darkness and into the unblinking glare of the law, but the adrenaline that had fueled their marathon was a slow-acting chemical that required months to fully drain from their systems. Outside the walls of the police department, the financial and structural liquidation of Raymond Cain's historic existence proceeded with the cold, administrative momentum of a corporate bankruptcy. The state's Asset Forfeiture Division, working in direct coordination with civil attorneys representing the Vance estate, initiated a comprehensive audit of every piece of property, every bank account, and every retirement dividend the killer had accumulated since December of 1999. The modest suburban home where he had spent his decades of unearned freedom was boarded up, its locks changed, and its title transferred to a public trust, a physical symbol of a life completely hollowed out by the retrospective application of justice. For the neighbors who had lived within yards of his driveway for 25 years, the sight of the county workers loading his personal effects into the back of an anonymous utility truck was a necessary, cathartic stripping of his legacy, a public demonstration that the law would not allow a predator to retain the material comforts of a middle-class retirement built upon a foundation of hidden slaughter. The historical records of the gravel quarry where Cain had worked his night shifts were also subjected to a deep, forensic analysis by independent researchers interested in documenting the behavioral patterns of integrated predators. The logs revealed a terrifyingly consistent portrait of structural cloaking. Cain had utilized the heavy, loud, and naturally isolated environment of industrial excavation to mask his movements, using his familiarity with regional transit corridors to scout locations without ever raising a single red flag in his employment file. He had been a perfect employee, punctual, quiet, entirely reliable, and completely invisible to the management teams who operated the facility. This revelation forced a broader conversation within the regional utility and manufacturing sectors regarding the psychological profiling and background verification standards for individuals assigned to independent night watches along critical highway grids, transforming the Vance case into a baseline warning about the dangers of institutional blind spots in the security of public infrastructure. The physical site of the old railway overpass on Route 9, now fully illuminated by strings of high-intensity LED units, became a point of dramatic architectural reinvention for the city's urban development boards. A local architectural firm was commissioned to design a permanent public installation that would completely integrate the iron span into the town's modern commercial transit system, replacing the grim, historic imagery of avoidance with a bright, functional space dedicated to civic connectivity. The concrete barriers that had blocked the lower corridors since the early 2000s were crushed and repurposed as foundation gravel for a new pedestrian bicycle trail that connected the residential sectors of Iron Ridge directly to the newly revitalized riverfront district. The transformation was an explicit act of geographical warfare waged by the town council against the memory of the crime. They were actively erasing the predator's playground from the map, converting a historic site of terror into an ordinary, well-traveled component of the daily municipal grid. Despite the rapid physical improvements, the sociological scars within the older neighborhoods of Iron Ridge remained an active, shifting factor in the community's collective psychology. The parents who had raised their families during the peak years of the unsolved era found themselves struggling to relax the hypervigilant habits they had practiced for nearly 3 decades, their internal survival mechanisms still triggered by a late school bus, an unfamiliar delivery truck, or a brief lapse in cellular communication with their adult children. The trauma had worn deep, permanent grooves into the social architecture of the county, creating a generational divide where the elders still viewed the evening fog with an instinctive, defensive suspicion, while the younger citizens walked the newly lit corridors of Route 9 with the easy, unbothered confidence of individuals who had never known a time when a monster walked their streets with impunity. The town was living in a delicate state of transition, a period of historical decompression where the threat had been entirely neutralized, but the muscle memory of the fear required time to smooth over. The long-term study launched by the university's sociology department to track the half-life of fear in communities recovered from chronic criminal trauma released its preliminary report in the fall of 2027, utilizing Iron Ridge as its primary empirical model. The data confirmed that the forensic leap and the subsequent conviction of Raymond Cain had produced an immediate, measurable lift in the overall economic confidence and psychological well-being of the city center, resulting in a sudden surge of small business investments and residential property sales in areas that had been historically stagnant since 1999. However, the study also identified a complex phenomenon labeled retrospective vulnerability, a state where residents experience sudden, acute waves of anxiety as they realized how close they had lived to the danger for 27 years, their minds constantly replaying past interactions with Kane and wondering how easily their own families could have crossed his path during his night patrols at the quarry. In the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the Regional Medical Examiner's office, the forensic anthropology team that had assisted in the recovery of Clara Vance's remains at the strip mine finalized their comprehensive taphonomic report. The document was a masterpiece of clinical science, detailing the exact environmental, chemical, and geological conditions that had preserved the skeletal matrix beneath the concrete slab for nearly 3 decades. The unique composition of the coal slag, combined with the absolute exclusion of moisture and oxygen achieved by the industrial foundation above, had effectively halted the typical processes of organic decay, leaving behind a pristine physical record that allowed the pathologists to document the mechanics of the trauma with the absolute precision of a fresh autopsy. The report became a foundational text for forensic programs nationwide, an empirical demonstration that the Earth does not destroy evidence if the conditions are correct, but instead functions as a natural vault that will preserve the signature of human violence until the law arrives to claim it. The family of Clara Vance, having successfully completed the private burial service that restored her to the dignified custody of her lineage, transitioned their public focus toward the establishment of a charitable foundation dedicated to funding advanced DNA testing for unresolved missing persons cases across the tri-state area. They refused to let her legacy be defined by the concrete slab or the clinical text of the medical examiner's report. They wanted her name to function as an active, driving engine for the liberation of other families who were still trapped in the freezing dark of an unsolved tragedy. The Clara Vance Endowment for Forensic Justice was launched with a massive initial contribution compiled from the liquidation of Kane's forfeited assets, creating a permanent, self-sustaining financial reservoir that allowed small, underfunded police departments to access the high-throughput sequencing arrays and genealogical databases that had broken the Iron Ridge case. The foundation was an extraordinary display of communal alchemy, turning the literal currency of the predator's freedom into a tool that would systematically dismantle the anonymity of other monsters across the country. As the winter of 2027 began to settle over the state, bringing with it a hard, gray sky and a biting northern wind that whistled through the newly painted girders of the railway overpass, the old detective, Thomas Miller, became a regular fixture at the Civic Center where the plans for the permanent Clara Vance Memorial Pavilion were being finalized. He sat in the back row of the committee meetings, his hands clasped over the handle of his walking stick, his eyes fixed on the blue-lined blueprints displayed on the presentation boards. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a steadying, moral anchor for the architects and city planners who were tasked with constructing the sunlit pavilion within the Central Park. For Miller, the building of the pavilion was the final, structural verification that his life's work had not been an exercise in historical futility. It was the physical proof that the promise he had made to a missing girl in 1999 had been paid in full, and that her memory had been completely rescued from the dark archive boxes of the precinct basement. The digital ledger that housed the complete, unvarnished history of the Iron Ridge investigation was officially selected by the National Law Enforcement Museum as a permanent digital exhibit illustrating the evolution of forensic science across the turn of the century. The archive was accessed by thousands of online researchers, students, and legal scholars who wished to study the precise chronological interface between old-school, boots-on-the-ground detective work and the high-velocity data processing of modern genetic genealogy. The record stood as an unassailable monument to human persistence, a clear warning to any modern criminal that the timeline of justice is inherently longer than the lifespan of any biological concealment. It proved that in the contemporary era, a single cell of human skin is a sleeping time bomb that will inevitably detonate in the hands of the perpetrator, no matter how many years he spends building a life of ordinary respectability in the aftermath of his crime. The transformation of Iron Ridge was completed not by a grand celebration or a public parade, but by the quiet, collective return of the city's ordinary evening routines. On the final night of December 2027, precisely 28 years to the hour since Clara Vance's sedan had been found humming beneath the overpass, a light snow began to fall over the county, dusting the iron girders of Route 9 with a clean, white sheet of winter frost. Cars moved smoothly beneath the span, their headlights reflecting off the polished steel and the clear, wide lanes of the newly opened bicycle path, their drivers never pausing, never looking back into the dark spaces of the tree-lane with the old, paralyzing terror. The town had reclaimed its landscape, it had healed its institutional soul, and it had proven that the light of truth, though sometimes delayed by the limits of contemporary human knowledge, is an inevitable, unstoppable force that will always, eventually, find its way home, leaving behind a silence that was no longer terrifying, but finally, rightfully, peaceful. The entry into the early months of 2028 solidified the narrative of the Iron Ridge Resolution, transforming the raw, high-velocity energy of the trial into the deep, quiet architecture of permanent communal memory. The conviction of Raymond Cain had weathered every automatic appeal. His physical presence was locked behind the unyielding, multi-layered security gates of the state penitentiary, and the high-profile media crews had completely vanished from the streets of the county. Yet, the true finality of the notorious 1999 cold case was not achieved by the slamming of a cell door or the filing of an appellate brief. It was achieved through the slow, systematic dismantling of the psychological infrastructure that had held the industrial town hostage for 28 years. The town was learning to inhabit a completely new temporal reality, a space where the past was no longer an active, dangerous predator waiting beneath the dark span of the railway overpass, but a finished, fully catalogued historical document preserved under the unblinking eye of forensic science. The internal operations of the Iron Ridge Police Department's specialized cold case division had settled into a rhythm of remarkable, quiet efficiency that served as a model for law enforcement organizations across the country. The computational biology suite on Elm Street, funded in part by the liquidation of the Predator's seized assets, had become a center of excellence for genetic genealogy, attracting top-tier analysts from federal agencies who wished to study the precise administrative protocols that had kept the 1999 steering wheel sample pristine across nearly 3 decades of municipal neglect. The investigators who had stood on the front lines of the 2026 breakthrough were now the institutional elders of the department, their daily routines no longer driven by the frantic, obsessive chase for a nomadic shadow, but by the meticulous, deliberate application of modern science to other forgotten folders in the evidence vault. They had proved that a cold case is not a natural state of permanent mystery, but a temporary limitation of contemporary technology, a temporary silence that will always, eventually, be shattered when the tools of the future are allowed to read the biological records of the past. Outside the walls of the precinct, the physical construction of the Clara Vance Memorial Pavilion within the town's Central Park had reached its final, defining phase. The project, designed by a local architectural firm that had volunteered its time to help heal the city's historic wounds, was constructed as a wide, sunlit structure of white limestone and clear glass, completely free from the grim, shadow-filled spaces that had characterized the landscape of Route 9 since the winter of 1999. The pavilion was positioned at the exact geographical center of the park, surrounded by newly planted beds of winter roses and connected to the main municipal transit paths by a wide, well-lit pedestrian walkway. For the citizens of Iron Ridge, the building of the structure was a necessary, tangible act of cultural reclamation. They were actively installing a monument to their own resilience at the heart of their civic life, converting the memory of a tragedy into an active, functional space dedicated to music, community education, and the open celebration of their shared safety. The old detective, Thomas Miller, who had carried the crushing weight of the unresolved investigation through the long, barren decades of his active service, could be found at the pavilion site almost every morning, his hands resting heavily on the handle of his walking stick as he watched the masons set the final stone steps into the earth. The black and white photograph of Clara was no longer tucked into his coat pocket, and his mind was no longer trapped in that perpetual, agonizing loop of the freezing midnight fog beneath the railway overpass. He had lived to see the absolute completion of the contract he had signed with the community in 1999, his face showing a deep, clean exhaustion that was entirely separate from the grinding, bitter frustration of his retirement years. Miller was no longer the custodian of an unsolved horror. He had become a witness to a complete, structural restoration. His presence at the park a silent, powerful anchor for the younger generation of residents who walked past him with the easy, unbothered confidence of individuals who had never known a time when a monster lived on their doorsteps with absolute impunity. The administrative team managing the Clara Vance Endowment for Forensic Justice reported a massive surge in genetic genealogy match requests from smaller, underfunded police departments across the tri-state area, demonstrating the profound, systemic impact of the Iron Ridge Resolution on the wider landscape of American jurisprudence. The endowment, fueled by the complete financial liquidation of Raymond Cain's historic assets, had created an unassailable financial pipeline that allowed rural communities to bypass the bureaucratic bottlenecks of state-run crime labs and directly access the high-throughput sequencing arrays and consumer genealogy networks that had broken the 1999 case. The family of Clara Vance monitored the Foundation's progress with a quiet, fierce dedication, refusing to let her memory be reduced to the clinical text of an old autopsy report or the sensationalized headlines of a true crime archive. They had successfully converted the literal currency of the predator's freedom into a relentless, machine-like tool that would systematically dismantle the anonymity of other phantoms across the nation, ensuring that their daughter's name would forever function as an active driving engine for the liberation of other families trapped in the freezing dark of an unresolved tragedy. The site of the abduction itself, the old railway overpass on Route 9, had completely shed its historic status as a place of chronic avoidance and urban decay. The city's Public Works Department had completed the installation of a multi-tiered public illumination matrix beneath the iron girders, completely banishing the heavy, historic shadows that had made the span a psychological barrier for 27 years. The pedestrian bicycle trail that ran through the lower corridors was now fully operational, bustling with weekend travelers, joggers, and local workers who moved beneath the sandblasted, freshly painted iron structures without ever pausing to look into the treeline with the old, paralyzing terror. The physical reclamation of the crime scene was complete. The town council had successfully waged a war of geographical erasure against the legacy of the predator, transforming a monument of territorial dominance into an ordinary, highly visible, and perfectly integrated component of the modern municipal grid. The long-term study conducted by the university's sociology department regarding the half-life of fear in communities recovered from chronic criminal trauma entered its second phase, utilizing the stabilizing environment of Iron Ridge to draft a definitive set of guidelines for municipal recovery in the aftermath of high-profile cold case resolutions. The data collected from local commerce logs, neighborhood safety surveys, and public health records confirmed that the arrest and conviction of Raymond Cain had triggered a sustained, measurable economic and psychological renaissance within the industrial sectors, resulting in a dramatic drop in chronic stress indicators among the older populace and a sudden surge in residential property investments along the Route 9 corridor. The town had successfully navigated the fragile, intermediate state of retrospective vulnerability, moving past the initial shock of realizing how close they had lived to the danger and settling into a robust, collective state of clear, unshakable confidence in the permanence of their security. In the climate-controlled archives of the State Historical Society, the digital ledger containing the complete, unvarnished record of the 1999 investigation was formally cataloged as a permanent educational asset illustrating the evolution of forensic science across the turn of the century. The archive was accessed daily by legal scholars, geneticists, and investigative students from around the globe who wished to analyze the precise chronological interface between old-school, boots-on-the-ground police work and the high-velocity data compilation of contemporary genetic archaeology. The file stood as an unassailable monument to human persistence, an objective, clinical warning to any modern criminal that the timeline of justice is inherently longer than the lifespan of any biological concealment. It proved with mathematical certainty that in the contemporary era, a single cell of human skin is a sleeping time bomb that will inevitably detonate in the hands of the perpetrator, no matter how many decades he spends constructing a life of mundane, ordinary respectability in the aftermath of his crime. As the deep summer of 2028 began to warm the county, casting a bright, clear light over the post-industrial landscape of Iron Ridge, the City Council announced the formal dedication ceremony for the Clara Vance Memorial Pavilion. The event was planned not as a somber, rain-slicked vigil, but as an open, vibrant celebration of the town's historical correction, featuring musical performances by local school bands, addresses by civic leaders, and a public presentation by the forensic scientists who had executed the historical leap. The entire community prepared for the gathering with a sense of quiet pride, recognizing that they were no longer a town marked by a question mark, no longer a cautionary tale whispered by elders to frighten children, but a community that had faced its worst nightmare, dismantled its lies with the unbending power of science and law, and earned the absolute, hard-won right to look forward to a future that was entirely their own to define. The final night of the dedication preparations saw a light summer rain move through the county, washing the dust from the white limestone pillars of the pavilion and clearing the air over the newly illuminated spans of the railway overpass. Cars moved smoothly along Route 9, their headlights reflecting off the clean asphalt and the wide lanes of the pedestrian path, their drivers never hesitating, never searching the dark edges of the woods for the outline of a monster. The beast had been dragged from his cave, his secret had been violently extracted from the earth, and the town of Iron Ridge had settled into its new baseline, a reality where the boogeyman was dead to the world, where the victim was resting with dignity beneath a stone that bore her name, and where the citizens could look at the sky without seeing the shadow of an unresolved crime. The long, agonizing march toward the truth was over, leaving behind a community that was scarred, yes, but also entirely, beautifully whole, its silence no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of an unresolved nightmare, but the deep, final, and peaceful quiet of justice completely served. The architecture of memory within the industrial heart of Iron Ridge continued its deep, multi-layered stabilization as the region pushed further into the year. The initial, frantic wave of shock that had accompanied the unmasking of Raymond Kane had long since subsided, leaving behind a community that possessed a matured, almost stoic sense of itself. The notorious 1999 cold case was no longer discussed in the hushed, defensive tones of an unresolved vulnerability. It had been fully processed, dissected, and integrated into the definitive historical canon of the county. The historic trauma that had acted as a suffocating, invisible weight for 27 years had undergone a process of profound crystallization, transforming from an active source of existential dread into a permanent, stabilizing cornerstone of the city's identity. Iron Ridge had successfully moved the needle from a state of chronic, often paralyzed hypervigilance to a state of proactive, informed resilience, proving that a community can look its darkest chapter directly in the eye and emerge from the crucible not shattered, but structurally reinforced. Inside the precinct house on Elm Street, the Specialized Cold Case Division operated as a permanent monument to the victory of empirical persistence over the void of the unknown. The high-throughput digital analytics suite and the advanced biological evidence retention systems that had facilitated the historic forensic leap were no longer regarded as experimental deviations from standard police methods. They were the standard architecture of the city's investigative capacity. The young investigators who now staffed the unit were a new breed of professional, individuals who balanced traditional tactical training with advanced degrees in molecular data architecture and computational genealogy. They looked at the faded analog field notes from the original 1999 search parties with a sense of deep, professional reverence. They understood that their primary responsibility was not merely to solve the crimes of the present, but to act as the disciplined stewards of the past, maintaining an unbending, generational commitment to the preservation of evidence until the science of the future was ready to decode its secrets. The physical reality of Iron Ridge's landscape had long since reconciled itself with the history that once threatened to permanently freeze its development. The old railway overpass on Route 9, once the central stage for a horror that had paralyzed the city's imagination, had completed its structural transformation into a bright, functional corridor of civic connectivity. The sandblasted iron girders, now coated in reflective, modern tones, stood beneath a multi-tiered array of high-intensity public illumination units that completely banished the heavy, historic shadows that had made the span a place of chronic avoidance for nearly 3 decades. The lower corridors, where Clara Vance's sedan had been found humming in the midnight fog, were now occupied by a bustling pedestrian bicycle path that integrated the residential sectors directly into the newly revitalized commercial district. The town council had successfully executed an act of total geographical reclamation, stripping the crime scene of its status as a predator's playground and rendering it an ordinary, well-traveled, and safe component of the daily municipal grid. At the heart of the city, the Clara Vance Memorial Pavilion had matured into the literal and figurative center of the town's social life. Built from pristine white limestone and clear glass, the structure functioned not as a macabre, true crime monument to an abrupt exit, but as an active, light-filled sanctuary for the living. On any given afternoon, the stone steps and sunlit plazas surrounding the central pavilion were filled with the sounds of a community thriving, local high school students analyzing civic data on their tablets, neighborhood families taking walks through the manicured rose gardens, and senior citizens sharing stories on the benches. The town had delivered the ultimate nonverbal rebuke to the intent of the perpetrator. He had sought to turn their landscape into a permanent theater of fear and isolation, but the community had countered by converting the memory of his violence into a catalyst for perpetual, thriving communal life. The regional educational system had completely codified the history of the 1999 cold case, transforming the timeline of the investigation into a rigorous, multidisciplinary curriculum that was mandatory for every student entering secondary education. The students did not study the case for its sensationalized or historic details. They analyzed it as a profound case study in the intersection of civil liberties, technological evolution, and the ethics of public safety. They engaged in structured debates regarding the legal boundaries of investigative genetic genealogy, the procedural standards required to maintain the chain of custody across multiple generations of law enforcement, and the psychological mechanisms of collective trauma recovery. By forcing the younger generation to analyze the darkest period of their town's history under a bright, intellectual light, Iron Ridge ensured that the memory of Clara Vance was preserved with dignity, transforming her legacy into a foundational lesson about the responsibilities of citizenship and the absolute inevitability of truth. The commercial and outdoor recreation industries of the county had also experienced a parallel, deliberate decoupling from the dark tourism that had once plagued the region like a parasitic swarm. The amateur web sleuths, the sensationalist true crime television crews, and the morbid online mystery hunters who had historically descended upon the town had long since vanished, driven away by strict municipal ordinances that prohibited the commercial exploitation of the tragedy. The vast expanses of the surrounding woods and the old industrial sectors had been restored to their natural, neutral state. The trails were now frequented by university conservation teams studying the limestone ecosystems, serious long-distance backpackers, and local families who walked the paths with the quiet confidence of a people who knew the shadows had been permanently chased out of the trees. The landscape had been liberated from its status as a repository of hidden horrors, returning to its true identity as a wild, beautiful, and completely indifferent piece of the earth. For the family of Clara Vance, the progression of the year brought a form of peace that was as absolute as it was hard-won. They had successfully navigated the turbulent, invasive media glare of the trial and the subsequent years of public scrutiny, and they had succeeded in the monumental task of reclaiming their loved one from the public domain. She was no longer an abstract symbol of a cold case file or a warning headline used by elders to frighten children. She had been restored to her proper, private place within the intimate, loving memory of her lineage as a bright, potential-filled individual whose life had been cut short, but whose dignity had been completely, systematically vindicated by the state. The Clara Vance Endowment for Forensic Justice, fueled by the total liquidation of Raymond Cain's forfeited assets, continued to function as a relentless, machine-like tool that provided critical funding for advanced DNA sequencing in unresolved missing persons cases across the country, ensuring that her name would forever act as an active driving engine for the liberation of other families still trapped in the freezing dark of an unsolved tragedy. The legal mechanisms that had been tested and refined during the Iron Ridge prosecution had become permanently woven into the state's constitutional jurisprudence, fundamentally altering the rules for long-term evidence retention and investigative privacy across the entire nation. The Iron Ridge Amendments set an unassailable legal standard for how genetic material must be stored, logged, and evaluated over decades, creating strict judicial firewalls that protected the data of innocent citizens while ensuring that true predators could never find shelter behind the deterioration of time or the limits of contemporary investigative frameworks. The town had not merely demanded retribution for its own loss. It had used the structural pain of its history to forge a more precise, more ethical mechanism of law that served as a shield for the entire Commonwealth. The legal scholars and historians who traveled to the Elm Street precinct to study these records found a community that possessed an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of the relationship between human rights, science, and the pursuit of truth. The digital archive that housed the complete, unvarnished history of the Blackwood Ridge and Route 9 investigation had itself become one of the city's most valuable, protected assets. Maintained within a decentralized network system that was completely immune to physical decay, political manipulation, or corporate monetization, the archive stood as an unassailable monument to human persistence. It was accessed by researchers from across the globe who wished to study the archaeology of evidence, the precise methodology through which a modern investigative team could reach back through nearly 3 decades of administrative shifts and extract a flawless, unassailable truth from a single, degraded biological sample. The archive was a quiet, permanent warning to any predator who believed that a crime could be buried deeply enough to escape the inevitable, encroaching tide of human innovation. It was the physical proof that in the modern era, the timeline of justice is inherently longer than the lifespan of any biological concealment. The old detective, Thomas Miller, who had carried the crushing weight of the unresolved investigation through the long, barren decades of his active service, had settled into a state of quiet, dignified privacy. He lived in a small home on the hills overlooking the town he had saved, his daily routines characterized by the peaceful, unremarkable routine of a man who knew his life's work had been completed to the absolute limit of his capacity. He did not write sensational memoirs, he did not grant interviews to online mystery mongers, and he did not seek the empty validation of public adulation. His satisfaction was entirely internal, rooted in the clean, cold knowledge that he had looked into the deepest dark of his town's history, endured the decades of public skepticism and internal self-doubt, and stayed at the wheel until the ship had been brought safely into port. When he walked through the bustling town square on market days, the nods he received from the residents were the deep, silent expressions of respect offered to an architect of the city's permanent safety. As the months continued to unfold, the story of Iron Ridge assumed a quality that was almost architectural in its structural integrity. The town had looked its own monster in the eye, dismantled his carefully curated facade with the unyielding, clinical power of modern science and ethical law, and emerged from the crucible not broken, but refined. The cold case was no longer a ghost that haunted the shadows of the railway overpass. It was a closed book, its pages sealed with the indelible ink of a final verdict. Iron Ridge stood tall under the clear, bright sky of a new era, a community that had proved that time is not a barrier to the truth, that justice is a dynamic, living pursuit, and that the morning, clear, bright, and undeniable, will always come to those who have the courage, the patience, and the unbending resolve to wait for the light. The long, agonizing march that had begun on that freezing winter morning in 1999 had reached its final, definitive destination, leaving behind a silence that was no longer terrifying, but finally, rightfully, peaceful. Looking back, the 1999 case stands as a landmark, a point in time where the past and the future met, and where the relentless, unyielding demand for justice finally, irrevocably won. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery has been solved, the files are sealed, and the city has emerged from the shadow of the unknown into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. Iron Ridge moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth, forever anchored by the knowledge that even in the face of the most daunting darkness, the truth will eventually prevail, and with it, the quiet, persistent, and undeniable peace of justice served. The long, agonizing march of 1999 is over. The story is finally, unequivocally, written in the indelible ink of history, leaving behind a city that is scarred, yes, but also entirely, beautifully, and rightfully its own. The deep, structural normalization of Iron Ridge moved into its next generational phase as the late 2020s transitioned into a broader era of permanent civic stability. The legal reality of Raymond Cain's conviction had become an immutable element of the county's historical framework, and the initial, white-hot shockwaves of his arrest had cooled into a profound, quiet baseline of societal knowledge. The notorious 1999 cold case was no longer a jagged splinter disrupting the daily consciousness of the citizenry. It had been fully absorbed into the regional canon, functioning not as a source of ongoing terror, but as the definitive historical pivot point that marked the town's transition from a state of raw vulnerability to a state of enlightened, proactive resilience. The forensic methods that had brought the long-standing mystery to its unassailable conclusion, the multi-layered, multi-generational mapping of genetic lineages across consumer databases, were no longer discussed as experimental marvels. They were now the foundational architecture of the state's investigative identity, an invisible infrastructure of factual certainty that guaranteed no secret could ever again remain permanently anchored in the dark. Inside the precinct house on Elm Street, the specialized cold case division had evolved from a temporary crisis management team into a permanent, highly sophisticated institute of forensic archaeology. The physical environment where the original 1999 investigators had spent decades breaking their health against walls of administrative dead ends had been completely stripped of its old, analog identity, replaced by a climate-controlled, data-driven command suite where the air hummed with the low, steady vibration of supercomputers processing biological code. The new cohort of detectives who occupied these desks were individuals who viewed the preservation of evidence as a sacred, generational trust. They had entered the field in the wake of the 2026 breakthrough, and their training was anchored by the Iron Ridge Protocol, a rigorous, unbending administrative philosophy that treated every microscopic cell, every faded fiber, and every degraded biological stain not as a stale historical relic, but as an active, living contract between the state and a victim whose voice had been violently silenced by time. The younger recruits understood with clinical clarity that their primary responsibility was to outlast the cunning of any predator by preserving the physical integrity of a crime scene until the science of the future was capable of reading its secrets. They looked at the yellowing, typed field notes from the late 20th century not with a sense of nostalgic detachment, but with a deep, technical respect for the early patrol officers who, despite their primitive tools, had maintained the chain of custody with enough discipline to allow the future to correct the errors of the past. The department had successfully institutionalized a culture of absolute patience, establishing an environment where a cold case was no longer regarded as an unavoidable failure of justice, but as a temporary, measurable delay that would inevitably be brought to an end by the steady, encroaching tide of human innovation and scientific progress. In the physical streets of the city, the landscape had completely reconciled itself with the history that once threatened to permanently freeze its economic and cultural development. The old railway overpass on Route 9, once the central stage for a horror that had paralyzed the imagination of a generation, had completed its transformation into a bright, beautifully integrated corridor of civic connectivity. The heavy iron girders, sandblasted and recoated in modern, light-reflective tones, stood beneath a massive, multi-tiered public illumination matrix that completely banished the deep, historic shadows that had made the span a place of chronic avoidance for nearly 3 decades. The lower corridors, where Clara Vance's sedan had been discovered humming in the midnight fog, were now occupied by a bustling pedestrian and bicycle path that connected the industrial sectors directly into a thriving, revitalized commercial waterfront district, effectively erasing the predator's playground from the geographical reality of the town. This complete physical reclamation of the crime scene was a vital, nonverbal declaration of victory by the community over the memory of the perpetrator. The town council had refused to allow the site of a tragedy to remain a permanent monument to individual malice. Instead, they had used the mechanics of modern urban design to convert a landscape of fear into an ordinary, safe, and heavily traveled component of the daily municipal grid. People parked their vehicles beneath the overpass during the evening hours without a single backward glance into the treeline, their movements no longer dictated by the frantic internal countdown that had historically driven their ancestors to flee the perimeter before the midnight fog rolled in. The geography of Iron Ridge had been liberated from the weight of its secrets, returned to the absolute custody of its citizens, and rendered completely neutral under the bright, steady glare of high-intensity LED light strings. At the heart of the town, the Clara Vance Memorial Pavilion had settled into its permanent role as the literal and figurative anchor of the community's social life. Built from pristine white limestone and vast, transparent sheets of structural glass, the pavilion functioned not as a somber, macabre monument to death, but as a vibrant, sunlit sanctuary for the perpetual celebration of living. On any given afternoon, the stone plazas and manicured rose gardens surrounding the structure were filled with the ordinary, beautiful sights of a city thriving. High school students analyzing historical texts on their digital tablets, neighborhood families taking lunches on the benches, and senior citizens sharing stories in the shade of the limestone pillars. The space had become a site of quiet, daily habit, a landscape where the historic trauma had been completely absorbed, processed, and neutralized, turned into something that was an essential part of the town's foundation rather than something that stood apart from it as a scar. The regional educational system had completely codified the history of the 1999 investigation, transforming the multi-decade timeline of the case into a rigorous, mandatory curriculum for every student entering secondary school. The young people of Iron Ridge did not study the case for its sensationalized true crime details. They analyzed it under a bright, intellectual light as a profound study in the intersection of civic ethics, technological evolution, and the protection of human rights. Students engaged in structured debates regarding the legal boundaries of investigative genetic genealogy, the procedural standards required to maintain the integrity of evidence across multiple generations of law enforcement, and the complex psychological mechanisms of collective trauma recovery. By forcing the younger generation to confront the darkest period of their town's history through a framework of analytical learning, the community ensured that the memory of Clara Vance was preserved not as an ancient ghost story used to frighten children, but as an enduring, foundational lesson in the responsibilities of citizenship and the absolute inevitability of truth. The commercial and outdoor recreation industries of the county had experienced a parallel, deliberate decoupling from the dark tourism that had once threatened to reduce Iron Ridge to a cynical, exploitative center of online mystery hunting. The amateur web sleuths, the sensationalist television crews, and the morbid souvenir hunters who had historically descended upon the town like a parasitic swarm had long since vanished, driven away by strict municipal ordinances that prohibited the commercial monetization of the tragedy. The surrounding woods and the old, abandoned manufacturing zones had been fully restored to their natural, neutral state as wild, beautiful pieces of the earth. The forest trails were now frequented by university conservation teams studying the limestone cliff ecosystems, long-distance backpackers, and local families who walked the paths with the quiet confidence of a populace that knew the shadows had been permanently chased out of the trees for good, leaving the landscape cleansed of its status as a repository of hidden horrors. For the family of Clara Vance, the progression of the decades brought a form of peace that was as absolute as it was hard-won. They had successfully outlived the monster in every way that mattered, navigating the long, invasive media glare of the trial, and the subsequent years of public scrutiny with an unbending, quiet dignity that earned the deep respect of the entire Commonwealth. They had accomplished the monumental, exhausting task of reclaiming their loved one from the public domain. She was no longer an abstract symbol of a cold case file, no longer a headline used to illustrate a town's vulnerability, but was restored to her proper, private place within the continuous, loving memory of her lineage as a bright, potential-filled young woman whose life had been cut short, but whose identity had been completely and systematically vindicated by the state. The Clara Vance Endowment for Forensic Justice, funded entirely through the complete financial liquidation of Raymond Cain's forfeited assets, continued to function as a relentless, machine-like tool that provided critical, unrestricted funding for advanced DNA